Welcome to Once Upon a Dream, your haven for soothing bedtime stories that bring calm and magic to your nights. If you found calm or joy in our stories and would like to support the channel, buying us a virtual coffee is a wonderful way to keep this dream alive. Thank you for being part of this journey. Your support means the world to us. Good evening. My name is Ben, and I'll be your guide tonight as we journey together into deep relaxation and restful sleep. Take a deep breath in through your nose, and as you exhale, feel the tension in your body begin to melt away. Allow your eyes to gently close and bring your attention to the soothing rhythm of your breath. With each inhale, invite calm and stillness into your body. And with each exhale, let go of any worries or thoughts from the day. Relaxing every muscle, every joint, and every cell. You are safe. You are calm. And you are ready to drift into a deep and restful sleep. Good evening, dear listeners. Tonight, I invite you to get comfortable, to nestle deep into your pillows, and let the worries of your day drift away like leaves on a gentle breeze. As you relax, I'm going to share a story that unfolds in a cozy corner of the world, where the rain taps softly against window panes, and books hold endless possibilities. Our tale, Raindrops and Hot Chocolate, is about finding connection in the quietest of moments. It's a story best heard as you're drifting towards dreams, when the world has slowed down and your mind is ready to wander through gentle places. You'll meet Thomas, a thoughtful bookshop owner who lives among shelves of stories, and Claire, who arrives one rainy evening like a character stepping out of one of his beloved books. As you listen, imagine the soft patter of rain, the warm glow of reading lamps, and the comforting scent of peppermint and old pages. This is a story that doesn't rush, that breathes with the same peaceful rhythm as your own relaxing breaths. So close your eyes if you wish, and let me guide you through this gentle tale of two souls, connecting through whispered words and quiet understanding. Chapter 1. The First Raindrop. The old bookshop creaked softly as rain tapped against its windows, each drop creating tiny rivers that caught the warm glow of the antique brass lamps within. Thomas moved quietly between the shelves, his fingers trailing along well-worn spines as he straightened books that didn't need straightening. It was a habit born of 20 years tending to this space, this sanctuary of stories that had become more home than shop. The evening had settled into that perfect, hushed moment when the outside world seemed to fade away, leaving only the gentle percussion of rain and the whisper of turning pages from the few customers scattered throughout the shop. Steam curled up from Thomas's forgotten cup of Earl Grey on the counter, mingling with the familiar scent of old paper and wood polish that perpetually hung in the air. When the bell above the door chimed softly, Thomas looked up to see a woman hurrying in from the rain. She paused just inside the entrance, carefully closing her umbrella and pushing rain-dampened hair back from her face. There was something about her that caught his attention. Not in the way that beauty demands notice, but in the way that some people seem to naturally belong in certain places. She belonged here, among the books and the rain shadows. She made her way to the counter, her footsteps nearly silent on the old wooden floors. "Could I get a hot chocolate, please? With peppermint, if you have it." Her voice was quiet, matching the shop's atmosphere perfectly. "Of course," Thomas replied, equally soft. He watched as she chose a seat by the large window, settling into the worn leather armchair as if she'd sat there 100 times before. She pulled a book from her bag, Gaiman's Ocean at the End of the Lane, and soon was lost in its pages, occasionally lifting her head to watch the rain trace patterns on the glass. As Thomas prepared her hot chocolate, adding a touch more peppermint than usual, he found himself studying the way she fit so seamlessly into his carefully curated world. The warm light caught the edges of her reading glasses, and her expression held that particular serenity that true readers wear when they've found the right book at the right moment. When he brought her drink, she smiled without looking up, murmuring a thank you that melted into the background noise of rain and quietly turning pages. Thomas returned to his counter, but his eyes kept drifting back to her corner. She read with complete absorption, one hand curled around her mug, occasionally using her finger to trace a line of text as if saving it for later. As closing time approached and the last customers began to leave, she carefully marked her place and gathered her things. The rain had softened to a gentle mist, and she paused at the door, looking back at her corner with what Thomas thought might be longing. After she left, he found himself walking to her table. The empty mug still held the faint scent of peppermint, and there was a small, clear patch on the foggy window where she had absently wiped away the condensation. Without quite knowing why, Thomas pulled a small note card from behind the counter and wrote, "If you enjoyed Gaiman's Ocean, you might find yourself at home in Keith Miller's The Book of Flying. The same rain-soaked magic, but gentler dreams." He placed the note on the corner table, weighted down by a small glass paperweight, and wondered if she would return. That night, as Thomas locked up the shop, the rain played a soft lullaby on the roof, and he felt as if the bookshop itself was holding its breath, waiting for tomorrow's weather forecast. Chapter 2. Paper Messages. A week of sunshine passed before the rain returned, bringing with it the soft shuffle of wet boots and the whisper of rain jackets being shed at the door. Thomas had left his note on the corner table each evening, though it felt a bit more foolish with each passing day. But as the afternoon light began to fade into evening's gray, she appeared again, this time shaking droplets from a bright blue umbrella. She made her way to her corner, and Thomas noticed the exact moment she spotted his note. Her hand hesitated over it, head tilting slightly as she read the carefully penned words. A smile touched her lips. Small, private, like a secret shared between old friends. When she approached the counter, she held both the note and the book of flying in her hands. "The hot chocolate with peppermint, please," she said, then added softly, "And thank you for the recommendation." That evening, she read until the shadows grew long, occasionally pausing to watch the rain, or make small notes in a tiny journal she kept beside her cup. Thomas found himself creating increasingly elaborate paths between the shelves that would take him past her corner, straightening books that were already straight, adjusting lamps that needed no adjustment. 3 days later, he found a response tucked carefully between the returned pages of the Book of Flying. Her handwriting was like rainfall, delicate, flowing with little drops where her pen had lingered too long. "You were right about the rain-soaked magic. I especially loved the part about the library of forgotten books. Reminded me of rainy afternoons spent in places just like this." "Have you read The Night Circus?" "The magic is different, but it has the same way of making you feel like wonder is hiding just around the corner." She had simply signed it with a single letter. C. And so began their paper conversation. Words floating between them like autumn leaves caught in a gentle breeze. Thomas found himself looking forward to her notes as much as her visits, each one revealing another small fragment of who she was. She loved the sound of rain on old roofs, preferred her tea with honey, and had once spent an entire summer learning to make origami stars. A fact she proved by leaving one, carefully folded from his own note, on her next visit. He learned to recognize the different ways she read. Some books she devoured quickly, barely looking up from the pages, while others she savored slowly, often rereading passages before moving on. She had a habit of touching words that moved her, as if she could absorb their meaning through her fingertips. Their notes grew longer, more personal. Thomas wrote about the shop's resident cat, an elderly tabby named Fitzgerald, who appeared on rainy days to claim the windowsill near her corner. She wrote about her job teaching music to elementary school students, and how some days she could still hear their enthusiastic but mismatched harmonies echoing in her dreams. One particularly stormy evening, Thomas found a note that made his heart skip. I've started to measure time by rainy days. The sunny ones feel like waiting, like the pause between movements in a symphony. Is it strange that this corner of your shop has become the place where the world makes the most sense? He understood perfectly. The shop felt different on the days when her corner sat empty, as if it too was waiting for the next rainfall to bring her back. That night, as he prepared to close, he left a new note on her table. Not strange at all. Some spaces have their own kind of gravity, drawing in the people who belong there. I think rain has a way of leading us where we need to be. Outside, the weather forecast promised a week of storms ahead, and Thomas found himself hoping they were right. Chapter 3. Winter's Whispers. As autumn surrendered to winter's embrace, the bookshop transformed. Thomas hung strings of tiny golden lights around the windows, their warm glow reflecting in the raindrops that now occasionally carried flecks of snow. He added thick woolen blankets to each reading nook, but took special care with Claire's corner, selecting a particularly soft one in deep blue that reminded him of her umbrella. Their notes had become a cherished ritual, each one a small gift unwrapped in quiet moments. Thomas began signing his with a simple T, mirroring her restrained signature. There was something intimate about this partial anonymity, as if they were characters in one of the novels that surrounded them, revealing themselves page by page. I've been thinking about why I like the rain so much. Claire wrote one evening, I think it's because it gives permission to slow down, to stay in, to linger. The world outside rushes less when it rains. You feel that too? Thomas found himself nodding as he read her words, understanding exactly what she meant. He replied that night, my grandmother used to say that rain is the world's way of taking a deep breath. I've always thought of the shop as breathing with it, expanding on rainy days to shelter more dreams and stories. Your corner seems to expand most of all. On a particularly cold Tuesday, when the rain had hardened to sleet that tapped more insistently against the windows, Thomas placed a small reading lamp with a stained glass shade beside Claire's usual chair. Its light cast pools of amber and blue across her table, transforming her corner into a kaleidoscope of gentle color. When she arrived that evening, snowflakes melting in her hair, she paused before sitting down. Her fingers traced the edge of the lamp, and she looked around as if searching for him among the shelves. Finding him nearby, pretending to reorganize a display of classics, she smiled. Not the small, private smile he had grown accustomed to, but something warmer that reached her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply, before settling into her routine. That night, her note contained just 2 words. "It's perfect." As December deepened, Claire began staying later, often until the shop's closing time. Their dance of careful distance continued. He would prepare her hot chocolate without being asked. She would smile her thanks from across the room. But something had shifted. The air between them felt charged with unspoken words, like the hushed anticipation before a symphony's first note. Her notes became more personal. She wrote about spending holidays alone by choice, preferring the quiet companionship of books to forced festivities. She described her apartment with its wall of mismatched bookshelves and the window seat where she would sit for hours watching the rain. Thomas found himself looking for her in every line she wrote, collecting these fragments of her like precious stones. "I've started writing something," she confessed in a note tucked inside her returned copy of The Shadow of the Wind. Nothing serious, just thoughts about rainy days and quiet places. "Would you read it someday?" "I would be honored," he replied, feeling as though he'd been offered a rare gift. These shelves hold countless stories, but I find myself most curious about yours. Their paths almost crossed completely one evening, when Thomas was balancing on a ladder to reach the highest shelf, and Claire rounded the corner unexpectedly. She steadied the ladder with a gentle hand, their eyes meeting properly for the first time. Neither spoke, but something passed between them. A recognition, perhaps, or a question. Before Thomas could find words, another customer called for assistance, and the moment slipped away like rain down a window pane. That night, as snow began to fall in earnest, the weather forecasters warned of an approaching winter storm. The season's worst, they predicted. Thomas found himself hoping Claire would stay home, safe and warm in her window seat with her books. Yet a smaller, more selfish part of him watched the darkening sky and thought of her corner sitting empty, and felt a pang of something like homesickness. As he locked up that night, the wind whispered around the eaves of the old building, carrying promises of ice and isolation. Thomas turned up his collar against the cold and wondered what words would be exchanged when the storm finally arrived. Chapter 4. The Storm. The morning dawned with an unusual stillness, the kind that often precedes significant weather. Thomas opened the shop earlier than usual, turning on extra lamps to ward off the premature darkness that hung outside. The radio murmured warnings of the approaching storm. Power outages likely. Residents advised to stay home if possible. Throughout the morning, customers hurried in and out, gathering books as if preparing for hibernation. Thomas helped an elderly man select several thick novels, enough to see me through if the power goes, the man had said with a wink. By early afternoon, the shop was empty, and Thomas considered closing early, watching as the first heavy drops began to strike the windows with unusual force. He was just about to turn the sign when the door opened, bringing with it a swirl of wind and the familiar figure of Claire, her coat buttoned to her chin, her hair already damp from the brief walk from her car to the shop. "You're here," Thomas said. unable to keep the surprise from his voice. Claire unwound her scarf, shaking raindrops onto the welcome mat. I heard about the storm. Thought I might need something new to read. Her voice was soft but steady. That is, if you're staying open? For you, Thomas said, then quickly added, for anyone who needs shelter from the storm. She smiled at that, a full smile that transformed her face, and made her way to her corner. Thomas watched as she settled in, arranging her things with the familiarity of someone coming home. The sight of her there, despite the warnings and the worsening weather, stirred something in him that felt like gratitude. As the afternoon deepened towards evening, the storm grew in intensity. Rain lashed against the windows, and wind moaned through the old building's eaves. The few other customers who had drifted in left quickly, clutching their purchases and casting worried glances at the darkening sky. Still, Claire remained, seemingly content in her corner as she worked her way through a new book, occasionally glancing up at the windows as if the storm were merely an interesting backdrop to her reading. Thomas brought her a fresh cup of hot chocolate without being asked. "They're saying it might get worse," he said, nodding towards the window. "If you need to leave, I'd rather stay," she replied, her voice barely audible above the rain. "If that's all right." The lights flickered then, as if in response to her words. They both looked up at the old chandelier that hung in the center of the shop, watching as it dimmed momentarily before brightening again. "That might happen a few times," Thomas warned. "The power in this part of town is temperamental." Claire nodded, seeming unconcerned. "I like it when the lights flicker in a storm," she admitted. "It feels like the world is breathing." Thomas couldn't help smiling at that. It was so similar to what he'd written in one of his notes to her. "Like taking a deep breath," he murmured. "Exactly," she replied, and their eyes met for a moment longer than usual. Outside, the storm crescendoed. Rain hammered against the glass with such force that Thomas worried about the old windows holding. The wind found every crack in the ancient building, creating a symphony of whispers and moans that seemed to surround them. The lights flickered again, longer this time, plunging the shop into momentary darkness before reluctantly returning. Thomas began lighting candles and lanterns. Emergency preparations he kept for the inevitable power failures of winter. He placed several near Claire's corner, the flames casting her in a warm, golden glow that softened the edges of everything. "Thank you," she said, as he set down a particularly beautiful stained glass lantern. "For all of this." She gestured vaguely around her, and Thomas understood she meant more than just the light. "The shop feels right with you here," he said, surprising himself with his candor, especially during a storm. She looked up from her book then, her eyes reflecting the candlelight. "I've been meaning to ask," she began. But at that precise moment, with a dramatic crack of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building, the lights went out completely. The sudden darkness was absolute, broken only by the small islands of light from the candles and lanterns Thomas had distributed throughout the shop. In the strange, newfound silence that followed, the absence of the subtle electrical hum that normally permeated the space, Thomas could hear Claire's soft breathing from her corner. The darkness seemed to wrap around them like a blanket, intimate and isolating all at once. "Thomas," her voice came through the dimness, using his full name for the first time. "I'm here," he replied, making his way carefully toward her corner, guided by the gentle light of the candles. As he approached, he could see her more clearly. Her book closed on her lap, her face turned toward him with an expression of curious anticipation rather than fear. Outside, the storm continued its assault. But inside the shop, in that moment, there was only stillness and expectation. "I think," Claire said softly as he reached her table, "this might be the perfect time for a proper introduction. Don't you?" The candle between them flickered, casting dancing shadows across her face. Thomas found himself at the edge of something new. The familiar territory of his shop transformed by darkness, by storm, by her presence. "Yes," he said simply. I think it is. Chapter 5. Candlelight. I'm Claire, she said, offering her hand across the table. In the gentle glow of the lantern, her smile held a touch of shyness that Thomas hadn't noticed before. Though I suppose you've known that since my second note. Thomas, he replied, taking her hand briefly. Her fingers were warm from cradling her mug. It's strange to finally say it aloud. A particularly fierce gust of wind rattled the windows, making the candle flames dance wildly. They both glanced toward the sound, then back at each other, sharing a smile at the storm's theatrical timing. I feel like I should offer you something, Thomas said, suddenly aware of his role as shopkeeper even in these unusual circumstances. I keep emergency supplies in the back room. Tea, perhaps? Something stronger? Claire's soft laugh was barely audible above the rain. Tea would be lovely. And maybe. She hesitated. Maybe you could join me. If you want to, that is. Thomas navigated through the shadowy shop to the small kitchenette behind the counter, where he kept an old camp stove for emergencies. The familiar motions of heating water and preparing tea gave him a moment to gather his thoughts, to marvel at how ordinary and extraordinary this evening had become. When he returned with a tray bearing a steaming teapot, 2 mismatched cups, and a plate of shortbread cookies he'd been saving for himself. Claire had rearranged her corner. She'd pulled up a second chair and draped one of the woolen blankets across it invitingly. I hope you don't mind, she said, gesturing to the chair. It seems silly to have you stand. Not at all. Thomas set down the tray and took the offered seat, feeling strangely as if he were visiting someone else's home rather than his own shop. I've often wondered what it would be like to sit here, to see the shop from your perspective. And Claire poured tea for both of them, the steam rising like ghosts between them. It's better than I imagined, he said truthfully. Outside, the storm continued its assault, but its intensity only seemed to heighten the coziness of their candlelit corner. The darkness had transformed the bookshop into an intimate universe, existing separate from the world outside, governed by different rules and possibilities. "I've been coming here for almost 3 months now," Claire said, warming her hands around her teacup. "But this feels like the first time I'm really seeing it." "The darkness changes things," Thomas agreed. "Makes some things invisible, others more clear. Like your handwriting," Claire said, smiling. "I spent weeks trying to picture who might be behind those careful letters. Your G's always have these perfect loops." Thomas laughed, surprised and pleased by her observation. "And yours slant just slightly to the right, as if they're leaning into the next word. You noticed that?" "I notice everything about your notes," he admitted, then quickly added, "Hazard of being a bookseller. You develop an eye for detail." Claire took a sip of her tea, regarding him over the rim of her cup. "Is that what made you leave that first recommendation? An eye for detail?" Thomas considered this, remembering the evening he'd first seen her reading by the rain-streaked window. "Partly, but it was also—" He searched for the right words. "It was like seeing someone recognize a song you love. You were reading in a way that made me want to share something with you." "I'm glad you did," she said softly. "Your recommendations have become a map of sorts. I feel like I've been following breadcrumbs you've left, discovering pieces of you in every book." The honesty of her words hung between them, delicate and precious in the candlelight. Thomas found himself unable to respond with anything but truth. "I've been doing the same with yours," he confessed. "Especially the night circus. When you mentioned it, I reread it that same night. I wanted to see the story through your eyes." "And did you?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I think perhaps I did." There was a passage about two people who know each other only through the things they create for one another. It reminded me of us. Claire nodded, her eyes reflecting the candlelight. I remember that part. The finest of pleasures are always the unexpected ones. You memorized it, Thomas said. Not quite a question. Some words stay with you, she replied simply. They fell into conversation, as easily as if they had been speaking aloud for months, instead of exchanging written words. Claire told him about her music students, how teaching them had rekindled her own love of playing. Thomas shared stories of the shop's history, how he'd inherited it from his uncle, who believed books were living things that chose their readers. The storm provided a constant backdrop to their words, occasionally punctuating their conversation with particularly dramatic claps of thunder. During one such moment, when the windows rattled so fiercely, Thomas worried they might break. Claire reached across the table and briefly touched his hand. "I'm glad I was here when the storm came," she said. "So am I," Thomas replied, feeling the truth of it in his bones. As the night deepened and the candles burned lower, their conversation meandered like a gentle river, sometimes flowing quickly with laughter, other times slowing to thoughtful eddies of silence. They discovered shared loves of bitter chocolate and old jazz records, a mutual dislike of cell phones at dinner tables, and the same favorite childhood book, The Secret Garden. Though Claire had loved it for the growing things, while Thomas had been fascinated by the hidden spaces. "It's strange," Claire said as she accepted a refill of tea, "how much we already know about each other, and yet how much there still is to learn. Like reading a familiar book and finding new passages," Thomas suggested. "Exactly like that," she agreed, her smile warm in the candlelight. The storm's fury gradually began to subside, the thunder growing more distant, the rain softening from violent lashing to a gentle percussion against the windows. The darkness around them felt less absolute somehow, as if the world outside was slowly remembering itself. "I should check the weather report," Thomas said reluctantly, not wanting to break the spell of their conversation but aware of his responsibility. He found an old battery-operated radio behind the counter and brought it back to their corner. The crackling voice of the weather announcer confirmed what they had already sensed. The worst of the storm had passed, though rain would continue through the night. Roads were passable, but caution was advised. Power restoration was underway in several neighborhoods. You should probably head home while there's a break in the weather, Thomas said, though he couldn't bring himself to sound convincing. Claire looked out at the rain-washed darkness beyond the windows. Then back at their candlelit corner with its empty teacups and comfortable chairs. Probably, she agreed, making no move to leave. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook. Remember, I mentioned I was writing something. Would you like to hear a part of it? Thomas nodded, settling back in his chair as Claire opened the notebook to a marked page. In the gentle light of the lanterns, with the rain providing a soft accompaniment, she began to read aloud words that spoke of quiet corners and patient waiting, of stories found and stories made. Her voice, melodic and clear, filled the bookshop with a different kind of magic than the one they had been sharing. No less powerful, but more deliberate, crafted with care. As she read, Thomas watched the way the candlelight played across her face, how she occasionally looked up to gauge his reaction, how her hands cradled the notebook as tenderly as she might hold a treasured book. In that moment, he realized that whatever had been growing between them through their notes had bloomed fully in the darkness brought by the storm. When she finished reading, a comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the steady rhythm of the rain and the occasional creak of the old building settling. "That was beautiful," Thomas said finally, meaning it entirely. Claire closed her notebook with care. "Thank you for listening. And for everything else. Thank you for staying," he replied simply. Outside, a streetlight flickered to life, casting a pale glow through the rain-streaked windows. the power was returning to their part of town, slowly bringing back the ordinary world they had briefly escaped. Claire smiled at the sight, a little wistfully. It seems our candlelit adventure is coming to an end. This part of it, perhaps, Thomas said, surprising himself with his boldness. But I have a feeling the story might continue if you'd like it to. I would like that very much, Claire replied, her voice soft but certain in the gentle glow of the dying candles.